great apostasy, not far off in the future. And we have this, we know about the conversion of the Jews to precede the second coming. So this all kind of, it's an interesting speculation. It's interesting to see kind of where this leads, and how, how the Holocaust might have, might kind of be a kind of a focus point for bringing this all into focus. And let me say something else, a little bit of a digression about the Holocaust, which I can't help, when I think about the Holocaust and its relationship to the Second Coming, I can't help thinking about the slaughter of the innocents and the first coming of Christ. Okay, I mean, we know that, that grace is brought about by suffering, and that times of extraordinary grace are brought about by times of extraordinary suffering. And I would like to think that the suffering of the Holocaust, I mean, we know that everything that happens on earth, right, is guided by divine providence, and that all things work together for the good for those who love God. And so I would like to think that the inconceivable suffering of the Holocaust is associated with a tremendous gift of grace, and maybe that gift of grace is not unrelated to the second coming. So let me close with going back to the chapter of Romans chapter 11. This is going back to the words of St. Paul, starting at the beginning now. St. Paul speaking. I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham and a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Okay, so somehow, mysteriously, the election of the Jews still has continued even after the coming of Christ. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it sought. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened, as it is written. God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that should not see and ears that should not hear, down to this very day. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see. I talked about that. Paul continues. So I ask then, have they stumbled so as to fall? By no means. But through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Okay? So here we see Paul suggesting a reason, one reason perhaps, why there was this mysterious blindness cast over the eyes of the Jews, which is that through their trespass, salvation has passed to the Gentiles. Okay? And it's easy to imagine what he means here, right? Because if the Jews had accepted Jesus as the Messiah wholesale, if you'll forgive the pun, it's easy to see how Christianity might not have spread properly to the Gentiles. And you see a hint of this already in the book of Acts, right? The first church council, the Council of Jerusalem, which is described in, I think, Acts 15, happened about the year 51, to determine, can Gentiles become Christian? Can we let Gentiles into the church? Or do you have to be Jewish to be able to be a Christian? Okay? So we already see this confusion about whether Christianity was open to the Gentiles. How much worse would that have been if all of the Jews had accepted Christ? If all of the Jews had become Christian, Christianity would have looked much more like it was a sect of Judaism, much more like it belonged to Judaism. And the Gentiles would have, I think, had the impression much more that as Gentiles they were at best second-class Christians. And as a Jew I can say, the Jews would have felt like the Gentiles were second-class Christians, right? They would have felt like we own Christianity, right? That this is part of us and we'll let you tag along as a caboose or something, right? Now all of that danger was avoided by the Jews having rejected Christianity and by force then Christianity having spread to the Gentiles. And if you read the book of Acts, it's very interesting. The pattern of Paul's evangelization is always the same. Everywhere he goes, he preaches first to the Jews, tends to get stoned or whipped or, thrown off a cliff. And then he preaches to the Gentiles in that town or in that area. And then he goes on to the next town or area. And what does he do? Does he learn from his lesson and preach first to the Gentiles? No, he goes back and preaches first to the Jews, gets whipped or stoned or thrown off a wall or something, and then preaches to the Gentiles. So we see this pattern, of it going out first to the Jews, and it's the rejection of the Jews that opens it up to the Gentiles. So anyway, let me go back to Paul. If their trespass, meaning the failure of the Jews to recognize Christ, means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, What will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? Okay? So here we have a mysterious suggestion that, as Paul says, if the Jews' rejection of Christ meant riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? If their rejection meant the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? And I think there is a suggestion here that when the Jews come into the church en masse, they will bring something very special. They will bring, I think, a revitalizing force into the church. Maybe it will be, to some extent, a counterweight to the apostasy of the Gentiles, and they will bring a new energy into the church, which I think is not unconnected to bring about the second coming. Let me go back to Paul. I haven't gotten so much trouble saying that. This is Paul again. If the root is holy, so are the branches. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, a wild olive shoot, were grafted in their place to share the richness of the olive tree, do not boast over the branches. If you do boast, remember, it is not you that support the root, but the root that supports you. You will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Right, the branches broken off were the Jews. The branches grafted in were the Gentiles. That is true. But even the others, if they do not persist in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God has the power to graft them in again. For if you have been cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted back into their own olive tree? Okay? So again, the suggestion that when the Jews enter the church, there will still be a special resonance there, because they were, in the beginning, the branches which were broken off. And Paul concludes, lest you be wise in your own conceits, I want you to understand this mystery, brethren. A hardening has come upon part of Israel, until the full number of the Gentiles come in, and so all Israel will be saved. Okay? So, tying it all together, that after the full number of the Gentiles has come in, this veil will be lifted from the Jews, they too will come in, and so all Israel will be saved. Now, and again, the fact that it's after the full number of the Gentiles come in suggests that it is this time of the Gentiles being fulfilled, the last stage before the second coming. Now, what's the current state of affairs? I will argue that the current Jewish conversion to Christianity is the greatest since apostolic times. I'll just give a couple of statistics. In 1967, there were 3 or 4 Messianic Jewish congregations in the United States. The Messianic Jews, that's the name for Jews who have accepted Jesus as the Messiah. By and large, they're not Catholic. By and large, they think of themselves as Messianic Jews or as Protestants. That is another, that's another topic, but I think that's a failure to some extent of the Catholic Church to evangelize them. The people evangelizing them are Messianic Jews and Protestants. So anyway, in 1967, there were 3 or 4 Messianic Jewish congregations in the United States with maybe a couple of hundred members. Today, there are about 300 such congregations with 200,000 Messianic Jews in the United States. And that 200,000 Messianic Jews compares to about 400,000 Orthodox Jews. So that for every 2 strictly observant Jews in the United States, there's already 1 Jewish believer in Jesus. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, verse 23, quote, he's sending out his disciples, right? I read this quote before. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man returns. Now, I talked to a Messianic Jewish woman from Israel who says that there is scarcely a town or city in Israel left today without a Messianic Jewish congregation. So it looks like they've almost run out of towns. By the way, I didn't read that quote before. I was a little bit confused. So I began with a quote from the Lehman Brothers. Let me close with a quote by the Lehman Brothers, because I have this agenda, not very much beneath the surface, of trying to exhort Catholics to at least think about the conversion of the Jews, at least care about the conversion of the Jews, pray about the conversion of the Jews, and maybe even do something about it, evangelize about it, in the right way when the circumstances arise. And let me say, because I probably won't have much time for questions, a lot of times Catholics ask me, like I have a Jewish friend or something, and what should I do to evangelize them? And there's one thing that's always safe and always wonderful, which is let them know what you have in the Catholic Church. Let them know why you're happy every morning when you show up for work after coming from Mass, if you do. Let them know what your prayer life means to you, the